Chapter 7. Jack Tames a Monstrous Nightmare, and worse, the Children of Berk. Hiccup was very aware that Berk was an unusual place, even without the dragons, especially if you weren't from the archipelago, which was the case for Jack and Jamie. However, Hiccup still thought it was a bit weird that Jack and Jamie reacted with awe and surprise towards things Hiccup himself took for granted. Like, how were they alive when it seemed none of them had ever held a weapon before? At least Jack seemed less shocked than Jamie, but judging by Jamie's reaction, Hiccup would have thought he'd never even seen a weapon up close. He didn't miss the way Jamie's eyes widened when they passed Mrs. Ack sharpening her battle axe. Hiccup decided not to tell him that the number of weapons they carried now was nothing compared to what it was like 4 years ago. But then again, Hiccup already knew these guys were weird. The way they kept making small comments in their native language to each other and giggling didn't help. Hiccup wasn't about to stop them, even if there was a part of him that was convinced they were talking about him behind his back. And as Hiccup showed them around the village, he was quick to notice that while Jamie was surprised by things Hiccup could sort of understand, Jack was a completely other story. There was just something off about him, from the way he carried himself to the way he looked at Hiccup or any other person in the village. There was a kind of jump in his step, but sometimes with a slight awkwardness to it, like Hiccup didn't know exactly how to describe it. Like the ground was shifting beneath him, or like his shoes were made of lead. And then there was his stare. As with his posture, he seemed relaxed and playful when he looked at Jamie. However, when he looked at Hiccup or any other person in the village, he seemed watchful and calculating, his gaze intense, until Hiccup would meet his eyes, and slight surprise passed over his expression, like he wasn't aware of his own staring. There was something about him that screamed, "I have no self-awareness," in a way that was awkward in a way even Hiccup could never be. Hiccup didn't know if it was funny or concerning. He managed to shove his curiosity away until a particularly bad stumble from Jack, and he sent him a look. "How are your shoes?" he asked. Jack's expression was disgruntled, but his eyebrows quickly rose into a mimic of obliviousness upon meeting Hiccup's eyes. "Huh? Oh, they're all right," he said, looking down at his sad shoes. "A bit too small, maybe, but—" They were on their way to the dragon arena, away from the village, so that they wouldn't have to deal with the stares from the other villagers. Like Hiccup had predicted, they weren't all willing to trust Jack and Jamie right away, but at least no one had decided to tell them directly, yet. Hiccup grimaced a little. "Yeah, I guess they would be. I had these when I was 15, he said, sending him an apologetic smile. "Would have borrowed you some other shoes, but I usually don't make them in pairs, for obvious reasons." Jack was only slightly better than Jamie at keeping his poker face, both of their eyes flickering to Hiccup's prosthetic. "Seems a lot of people are missing limbs around here," Jack then said. Hiccup nodded. "That's Berk for you." Jamie frowned, glancing upwards, but Hiccup didn't catch what he was looking at. He did that a lot. They both did. Jack frowned, shifting his hold on his staff. "Is this really a safe place to be, then?" he asked. "Actually, not counting the last few months, Berk had the most peaceful 3 years it had in, well, since ever, I think," Hiccup said. There was a guilty lump forming his chest the more he spoke, but he ignored it. "But, the last few months, me and the other guys were out exploring the archipelago, and then we found trouble. Or, I found trouble, I guess." He already knew there was no point in thinking about what-ifs, but maybe they wouldn't have lost so much had Hiccup never found the Dragon Eye in the first place. But then again, maybe Krogan would have found it, and then they would have had no way to fight back. No, it was over now. There was no reason to think about what could have been. "What kind of trouble?" Jamie asked. Hiccup hesitated. He could hear Astrid and Stoic in the back of his mind, telling him to be careful about revealing too much information to these strangers. But that war was over, and the Dragon Eyes were gone for good. He doubted there was anything Jack and Jamie could do with that information. "We found something, a kind of treasure," he said, and couldn't help but smile at the stars forming in Jamie's eyes. "A map, actually," he corrected himself. Jamie's mouth was just an O at this point. "A treasure map?" Well, sort of," Hiccup said, and put a hand on Toothless's head, stroking him absent-mindedly. "A map to find the King of Dragons." "Whoa," Jamie gasped, looking up at Jack as if to ask, "Can you believe this?" and then back at Hiccup. "What happened? Did you find it?" No, Hiccup said. It wasn't a complete lie. He'd never actually seen the dragon, but the fact that it had been there was very obvious. However, it was sensitive information. Hiccup had destroyed the dragon eyes for a reason. Nobody should know about it. Still, Jamie's disappointed expression, and Jack's for that matter, made him want to give them a satisfying end to the story anyway. It's a complicated story, he said, gesturing with his hands as he spoke. The map fell into the wrong hands, but I managed to replicate it. It was a race, a game. He frowned at his own choice of words. It hadn't been long enough. Hiccup still felt exhausted even thinking about maces and talents, with or without life-threatening messages from Vigo. Is that how you lost your... Jamie grimaced. If it's okay to ask? Hiccup chuckled and shook his head. No, I lost my leg before that, he said. Jack was looking thoughtfully at him before his eyes went down to the shoes he was wearing. Hiccup got the feeling he was already doing the math, but he didn't say anything, which was relieving. He didn't like reciting that story. When did this happen? Jack asked instead. The race? Oh, like a couple of weeks ago, more or less, Hiccup muttered. Jack and Jamie had the same shocked expression on their faces, and Hiccup blushed. It's fine, though, he quickly added. It's over now, at least. That's what I hope. The maps are gone for good, and the location of the dragon is hidden. Somewhere safe, where the wrong people won't find it. Somewhere nobody will find it. Who's the wrong people? Jack asked. What did they want? Hiccup smiled grimly. Not everyone realizes what amazing, loyal creatures dragons are, he said. He looked over at Toothless. We only realized that recently, too. Not everyone agrees with that notion. Speaking of... They came to a stop in front of the arena, and Hiccup gestured at it. This is a former dragon fighting arena, he said, not quite meeting Jack and Jamie's eyes as he said it. Berk's past relationship with dragons wasn't something Hiccup was proud of. Obviously, it's not used for that anymore. We used it as our dragon training academy for a while, and though we still use it for dragon training sometimes, these days it's usually... His voice got stuck in his throat when fire suddenly shot out over the top of the arena, followed by the distinct cry of a monstrous nightmare. Hiccup deadpanned, letting his hands fall. Empty, he finished. He picked up the pace towards the arena's entrance. I swear to the gods, if Snotlout and the twins are training unsupervised again. He hurried into the arena, Toothless at his side and Jack and Jamie at his heel. He groaned exasperatedly at the sight that awaited them. Gustav, and a bunch of kids crowding around his dragon, Fanghook. Fanghook was stomping around, with Gustav on his back, grinning triumphantly at the kids. So, as you can see, Monstrous Nightmares might be extremely dangerous and difficult to train, Gustav was saying. Quite possibly the most difficult, if you ask me or any other qualified dragon trainer in... Gustav, Hiccup interrupted, stumping over to them. How many times have I told you... Toothless! Fishlick's niece, Brenda, exclaimed excitedly, and in the next second all the kids had left Fang out in favor of petting Toothless. Toothless had a miserable expression on his face as the kids surrounded him, but didn't do anything to stop them. Hiccup tried to count them. Brenda, Brand, Shrug, Anders, Thralfnur, Skade. He gave up and left Toothless to deal with them while he reprimanded Gustav. Gustav was smiling, climbing down from Fanghook. What? I was just showing the youngsters how to train a monstrous nightmare. How is that wrong? Isn't that what we do? Youngsters, Hiccup repeated, almost laughing at his word choice, before shaking his head. Gustav, you can't just go and do this by yourself. Someone might get hurt. Gustav huffed. Well, sorry, Hiccup. Need I remind you that I have done much more difficult and dangerous things than showing a few kids how to... He cut himself off, his eyes landing on something at Hiccup's side. Hey, I don't know you. You're one of those blizzard boys. Hiccup looked down to see that Jamie was standing slightly behind him. He looked a bit uneasy, but once Gustav's attention was on him, he tried feigning confidence by straightening his back, frowning at Gustav. Blizzard boys? Jamie asked. Sounds like a boy band or something. Hiccup didn't know what he was talking about, but didn't get the chance to ask. Jamie's voice had made the other kids turn around bewilderedly. It's him, Anders said, pointing at Jamie. And soon enough, the kids were flocking around Jamie instead, talking over each other. Somehow, Hiccup was pushed out of the circle, and Jamie remained standing there alone with a slightly overwhelmed look on his face. What's your name? Skadi asked. How old are you? faltered Thrafnedur. Is it true they found you in the snowstorm? Undis demanded. Jamie didn't get to answer anything because questions just kept coming. "Where you from?" Brenda asked. "Where's the other boy?" Brent said at the same time. "My mom said you were angry at the gods and that's why the blizzard hit us." "Yeah, what did you do?" "All right, that's enough," Hiccup cut in, trying to intervene, but the kids completely ignored him. So much for being the son of the chief. Kids never listen to anybody. "Be nice to him. Hey, Andis, that's..." He let out a frustrated sigh and looked around for Jack to ask if he wasn't going to do anything about this. Then he belatedly registered what Brandt had said and ended up turning in a circle without spotting Jack anywhere inside the arena. "What the..." he started, but then spotted something else. The tail of a hideous zippleback, just outside the entrance of the arena. Hiccup face-palmed, knowing exactly what was going on out there. "Oh, gods," he muttered. He looked at Gustav and pointed at the kids. "Make sure they behave," he said. "I have to stop a disaster from happening." Gustav gave him a thumbs up, and with his obnoxious voice, he easily distracted the kids from bombarding Jamie with any more questions. "All right, kiddos, over here." Hiccup didn't wait to listen. "Come on, Toothless," he said, and they hurried out of the arena. "And after talking to our wise cousin Agnod, we've come to the conclusion that you're probably not a troll. But that possibility isn't completely ruled out," Toughnut was saying, with Roughnut nodding approvingly beside him. Somehow, Jack looked neither offended nor intimidated, even with Barf and Belch looking over Rough and Tough's shoulders, with their 4 eyes trained curiously on Jack. In fact, he looked mostly amused about it all, looking at the twins as if he was genuinely interested in what they were saying. "What are you doing?" Hiccup interrupted. "Not now, Hiccup. This is important," Roughnut replied dismissively. "This is crucial," Toughnut agreed. Jack sent Hiccup a smile, leaning casually on his staff. "Yeah, you should listen to them, Hiccup," he said. "They're making some very good points. How would you know I'm not a troll, even if I'm not barefoot anymore?" Roughnut pointed at him. "But you wish you were barefoot," she said. Jack nodded. "You're right." "But then, what about the kid?" Toughnut muttered thoughtfully, scratching his chin. "He must be a troll, too. And yet sources tell us he's always worn shoes. Unless you were cursed. I was cursed once by a lichen wing. It bit me and..." "All right, Toughnut. We already figured out that it wasn't a lichen wing bite, and you're not cursed," Hiccup said. "You say that, but I know I'll never be the same," Toughnut said grimly. Hiccup walked up to stand between the twins and Jack. "And Jack isn't cursed either, so..." "Bold of you to say that, Hiccup," Jack interrupted, now wearing that mischievous smile on his face. "You don't know me." Hiccup sent him a long look. "Not helping," he said. But Jack's eyes just glinted with mirth. "Let me ask you this, Jackson Overland," Toughnut said, leaning in very close. "Jack is fine," Jack said. He took a step back to regain some personal space, but Toughnut didn't pay that any mind. "Are you trying to confuse us? Because that, my good friend, will take some work. We Thorstons are not easily tricked." "You sure about that?" Hiccup mumbled. "We will figure you out, Jack," Toughnut promised, pointing at his own eyes and then at Jack's. "Mark my words." Jack's gaze didn't waver. "I'll be impressed if you can," he told them, and if Hiccup didn't already know he was just messing with them, he would have been fooled too. It took a lot of willpower not to roll his eyes, because while Jack was running the twins up for his own strange amusement, he didn't know what he was getting into. And Hiccup was about to tell him that, but just then Fanghook's roar split the air, followed by a series of frightened shouts and screams from the kids inside the arena. Jack somehow stumbled again, even if he was just standing there normally, before he slipped past Rough and Tough and bolted into the arena. Hiccup barely heard him hiss out something that sounded like a curse or something. They all sprinted after him. Inside the arena, Gustav was sprawled on the ground, pressing a hand against his forehead. Fanghook was on fire, standing on his hind legs, and between him and the wall of the arena stood Jamie. From the looks of it, Hiccup could guess that Gustav had been trying to show off, and it had all gone horribly wrong, because of course it had. It was Gustav. Jack was far ahead of him, running to Jamie's side. Hiccup didn't know what Jack thought would happen, but he knew that he wouldn't last long in front of the riled-up Monstrous Nightmare if he didn't know how to handle him. But he was already too far away, so all Hiccup could do was shout, "Jack, don't!" Jack didn't stop. Instead, he jumped in front of Jamie and pointed his staff at Hookfang, as if a piece of wood would help him against a fire-breathing dragon who was on fire. Toothless bolted forward, but came to a sudden stop when something completely bewildering happened. The flames from Fanghook's body melted away, and the dragon backed off. His head was tilting from side to side, as if he was hearing a distant sound. Jack lowered his staff and let out a relieved, airy laugh. He said something in his native tongue, a word Hiccup thought he'd heard him say several times during their tour of Berk. Jamie tentatively looked up, and though his face was pale, fear quickly faded from his expression as Fanghook backed away. Hiccup exchanged a look with the twins. They looked as confused as he felt. What had just happened? After a few seconds of stunned silence, Hiccup walked up to Jack and Jamie. Are you okay? He asked. Jamie looked up. Yeah, he said, and even if his voice quavered, he did actually look completely unharmed. The other children had begun to inch closer again now. Gustav was back on his feet, standing by Fanghook's side with a perplexed expression. Jack looked at Fanghook, laughed softly, before turning his gaze to Hiccup. No harm done, he said, and if Hiccup didn't imagine it, he thought Jack's smile looked a little too innocent. Behind Hiccup, the twins were muttering quietly, trying to make sense of what they'd just seen. He couldn't blame them. After chasing Gustav and the kids out of the arena, they all ended up walking back to the village together. Hiccup had been a bit miffed about it at first, because he wasn't very good with kids, and especially not a bunch of kids that were already worked up because of what had just happened. But he was quick to realize that he had nothing to worry about. On the way back to the village, he barely got to speak to any of the kids, or anyone at all, because of one simple reason. Jack was amazing with kids. Hiccup didn't know how or why, but no matter what those rowdy kids said or did, Jack knew how to respond. Even if there were 7 kids surrounding him, all asking questions, all clamoring for his attention, maybe aside from Jamie, who was in the spotlight together with Jack, he managed to include everyone. And if one of the kids did something bad, like asking an inappropriate question or fighting with each other, Jack knew exactly what to do to distract the kids and make them laugh again. It was some kind of miracle. Hiccup couldn't help but stare, and so did Gustav and the twins. None of them had seen anyone be able to control so many Berkian kids at once, and with such ease, too. By the time they made it back to the village, Jack had somehow dodged all their questions about the mysterious arrival and about their background, while still keeping the kids entertained and content. Much to Hiccup's disappointment, who'd hoped the kids would manage to open Jack and Jamie up a bit. But to no avail. The kids were all wrapped around Jack's little finger, and the weirdest part was that Jack seemed to be having as much fun as the kids were. They were well into the village when Toothless began nudging Hiccup's hand, growling incessantly. He was impatient. He wanted to go flying, but Hiccup didn't know what to do with Jack and Jamie in the meantime. He definitely couldn't take them with him on Toothless. The flights were too wild and dangerous, and Hiccup also didn't want to teach them anything about dragon riding before he was sure he could trust them. I hear you, bud, he mumbled, patting Toothless as he looked back at Jack and Jamie. They were still chatting with the kids. Jack seemed more energized than ever. Hiccup shook his head and looked back at Toothless. I'll just finish showing them around, and then we'll go, all right? Toothless grumbled, clearly not satisfied, but he let the matter go for now. Oh, there's more to see? Jack asked, clearly having overheard their conversation. If he thought it was weird that Hiccup was talking to Toothless, he didn't mention it. Hiccup shrugged. If you're interested, he said. I also need to go up to the forge. Garber should be back by now. Garber, huh? Jack thought thoughtfully. The forge sounds cool, right, Jamie? Yeah, Jamie replied, with even more enthusiasm than Jack. Hiccup had never seen anyone so excited about the forge before. Do you have to leave? Brenda asked, looking crestfallen. Jack smiled and ruffled her hair. We'll be around, he said. There's always another day. The children all moaned in disappointment, but Jack said that he could play with them again soon, and that they could play with Gustav and the twins in the meantime, much to Gustav and the twins' protests. Hiccup didn't really trust them with the kids either, but the words were already out, and soon enough they'd all run off to Odin knows what, but only if Jack promised to play with them another day. Jack didn't look like he thought that was a bad idea at all. And then they were headed towards the forge. Hiccup found it hard to speak now, compared to how easy the conversation had flowed on their way to the arena. What had happened in the arena was just so strange. Hiccup couldn't look at Jack and Jamie without thinking about it. It didn't take long for him to crack. What happened back there? He asked. Jack, who'd been saying something to Jamie in his native tongue, looked up. What do you mean? He asked back. Hiccup raised a brow, because it was obvious, wasn't it? In the arena, he said. How did you stop Fanghawk from attacking? Did you even know what you were doing? Jack hesitated, his eyes darting off somewhere, before going back to Hiccup. No, not really, he said. I usually don't, but things tend to work out anyway. Usually. He frowned, like he was considering that. Yeah, usually, he concluded. Hiccup had no idea what he meant, and it didn't do anything to help quench his curiosity about this strange duo. He pointed at Jack's staff. What kind of wood is that? He asked. Maybe it was something dragons didn't like, possibly monstrous nightmares in particular, since it didn't seem to have any effect on Toothless. Jack blinked and looked at his staff. He opened his mouth as if to answer, but then closed it again, his gaze going distant. I'm actually not sure, he said. I've never thought about it. Hiccup frowned. It must be something about the staff, but Fanghawk looked like... I don't know, he muttered. Was he just surprised? Maybe he thought you were holding a weapon, but that would just agitate him more, no? It doesn't make any sense. Maybe we were just lucky, Jamie suggested. Hiccup opened his mouth to argue, but then remembered he was talking to a child. He cleared his throat. Yeah, maybe, he said. Is that the forge? Jack asked. Hiccup looked up, momentarily distracted from his musings. Oh, yeah, he said. This is where we make all our weapons and saddles and all. But Gobber's also very good at fixing the dragon's teeth. A dragon with a toothache isn't pleasant. He spotted Gobber and waved at him as they approached. I also work here a lot, though not as much as I used to. Jack hummed. Didn't expect the son of the chief to like getting his hands dirty, he said, and though he sounded casual, it wasn't hard to hear the teasing undertone in his voice. Hiccup snorted. I'm the son of the chief, not a prince, he said. Grudgingly, he added, though I guess you have a point. Manning the forge is less of a dirty job than what the alternative was back then. Even when Berk was fighting against the dragons, I was never any good at it, so forge it was. You know how to make a sword? Jamie asked. Hiccup smiled at that. Of course, he said. Swords are easy. I'll show you how if you want to. Jamie definitely looked like he wanted to. Jack was smiling as well, which he did most of the time, but there was almost always a kind of elfishness about it that put Hiccup on edge. This smile, however, was kind and approving. Hiccup only saw it for a second before Jack grinned at Jamie, ruffling his hair. So now another thing was clear. Jack was strange, mysterious, and often off-putting, but his love for children was genuine and pure. Hiccup found it hard to mistrust someone like that, even with all his other bewildering characteristics. How's it going, lads? Gobber asked, as they finally walked into the forge. He was hammering on some kind of weapon, but turned around to face them as he spoke. Hiccup's not bothering you too much, is he? Jack blinked, like he was surprised. Oh, no, we're good, he replied, a beat too late, his tone oddly stiff. Hiccup didn't bother to question it. He just accepted Jack's weirdness at this point. Berk is very nice, too. You seem like, characteristic people. Jamie was staring at Gobber's hook, and then at his wooden leg. He kept his mouth shut, but Hiccup knew he wanted to ask. Gobber laughed. Characteristic, eh? Aye, that's one way to put it, he said. Oh, it's you guys. They all turned around at the voice, just as Snotlout stepped into view, holding a crossbow. He wore his usual arrogant smile, and looked pleased with the fact that he was holding a weapon to show off. He eyed them curiously. Oh, it's the Snot Boy, Jack said, before blinking. Did I say that in Norse? Jamie cleared his throat in a poor attempt to hide a giggle. It's Snotlout, Snotlout huffed. Snotlout Jorgensen. It's not that hard. Is that a crossbow? Jamie asked, and headed over to him. Hiccup wondered briefly if that was a good idea, but Jack was quick to follow, so Hiccup supposed he was in good hands. Jack could manage Snotlout on his own. Probably. In the meantime, Hiccup could do what he actually came here for. He turned to Gobber. I found something, he said, lowering his voice. Near the place where we found Jack and Jamie. Gobber raised a brow, and Hiccup walked around Toothless, who was really beginning to look impatient now, to rummage through the satchel at the side of the saddle. He fished out the crystal he'd found in the snow and held it out to Gobber. I'm not sure if it's theirs or not, but I thought it might reveal where they came from, he said. I don't recognize the rock. It's not something I've ever seen on Berk or anywhere in the archipelago. Gobber held the stone up to his eyes and studied it for a long time. The stone glistened coldly, even in the warm light of the forge, casting dim blue reflection on Gobber's face. He hummed. I've no idea, he said, and held the crystal back out to Hiccup. He glanced at Jack and Jamie, who were still busy talking to Snotlout. But it looks like it's worth a fortune. If I were you, I wouldn't bother asking them about it. Maybe it's not even theirs. He grinned. Behind them, Snotlout's loud voice carried across the room. Well, you won't be able to fight with just a stick of yours. You'll need a real weapon, like this. Hiccup didn't like to steal, but then again, he wasn't actually sure if this belonged to Jack or Jamie. Just because he'd found it where he'd found them didn't mean it was definitely theirs, right? He supposed he could ask them about it, but... I think I'm good with only the stick, actually, Jack responded, his voice just a little chillier than usual. Hiccup decided to take Gobber's advice and put the crystal back into the satchel. There was just something about it, something he couldn't quite put his finger on, that made him want to keep it. Or maybe he was just greedy, but it wasn't like he was planning to sell it. It just felt special. He was brought out of his thoughts when a loud clatter sounded behind him, and he whirled around to see Snotlout on the floor, with a bunch of different tools and metal pieces scattered around him. A table had been tipped over, probably in Snotlout's attempt to steady himself on it, by the looks of it. He was looking up at Jack, eyes wide. Jack straightened up from the defensive pose he'd been standing in, shifting his hold on the staff casually. Had he knocked Snotlout over? That swiftly? With only a wooden staff? Snotlout looked like he was asking himself the exact same questions. Jamie was standing by Jack's side, his mouth an almost comically round O. Told you, Jack said, proceeding to offer a hand to Snotlout. Snotlout didn't take it. How did you... he started, but caught himself. He got to his feet without Jack's help and stared at him. You tripped me. I wasn't ready. Don't take my staff, Jack defended with a shrug. It's just a piece of wood, Snotlout yapped. Jack opened his mouth to retort, but Gobber stepped in. That was an impressive move, he told Jack, wobbling over to him. Didn't take it for a fighter. You sure don't look like the type. Jack looked away from Snotlout and his expression relaxed again. He laughed, clearly not too offended by Gobber's brutal honesty. I guess not, he said. Who trained you? Gobber asked. Jack hesitated. No one, he replied. I'm self-taught. It obviously wasn't the answer Gobber was expecting. Hiccup, who hadn't even seen what Jack had done, could only wonder why. He wished he hadn't had his back turned, because Gobber and Snotlout both looked stunned. Only Jamie didn't seem surprised, though his eyes were darting nervously between Gobber and Jack. For all Hiccup knew, Jack could have just caught Snotlout off guard, like Snotlout claimed, because as obnoxious and as boastful Snotlout was, he was still a good fighter and not easy to be swept off his feet, especially not by someone who looked like Jack. But then again, Hiccup shouldn't talk too loudly about calling someone too skinny to be a good fighter. Whatever, I just wasn't ready, Snotlout protested, his face bright pink. I'll show you. Meet me in the... Right, I think it's time we see the, docks, Hiccup cut in, putting a hand on Jack's shoulder. Maybe he imagined it, but he thought Jack flinched ever so slightly under his touch. But if anyone else noticed, they didn't mention it. Battle of Honors can wait until everyone's completely settled in, Snotlout. Snotlout didn't look too happy about it, but Hiccup knew he was probably relieved to have a reason not to duel with Jack. He was all bark, no bite, usually. On their way out of the forge, Gobber called after them. Oh, by the way, he said, if the two of you are staying for a while, I could need a couple extra pair of hands in here. Just mentioning it. Jamie looked like Snoggletalk had come early. He looked at Jack with bright eyes, practically begging for his permission. Jack laughed and nodded at Gobber. We'll keep it in mind, he told him. What? Are you kidding me? Snotlout yapped, but Gobber ignored him, and so did the rest of them as they continued heading towards the docks. They were a couple of minutes away from the forge when Hiccup spoke up again. Don't worry about Snotlout, he said. He likes to act tough, but he's mostly just talk. Jack snorted. He's all right, he replied, making Hiccup raise his brow at him. You can't say he's annoying, he said. Nobody ever likes Snot Out at first. He's someone you have to get used to, and then someday you might see his good sides, buried deep, deep inside of him, under layers upon layers of not-so-good sides. It was Jack's turn to raise a brow. Isn't he your friend? He asked. Hiccup shrugged. Yeah, but we don't always see eye to eye, he replied. We've grown closer in the recent years, but we didn't start out as friends. To be fair, he could say the same thing about Astrid and the others, but Jack and Jamie didn't need to know that. Well, I think he's fun, Jack said. At least, interesting. Hiccup wondered how long it would take Snot Out to change Jack's mind, but decided not to say anything. But worry about the twins, he said instead, curious of what Jack had made of them. Jamie frowned. The ones back at the arena? He asked, glancing at Jack for confirmation. Why should we worry about him? I wonder too, Jack said, an amused smile on his face. So far they haven't done anything harmful, except calling me a troll, but I can take that. Look, they're a couple of muttonheads, but you can never predict what they'll do next, Hiccup explained, tapping his temple. Their logic isn't the same as ours, and if there's one thing they never think about, it's consequences. I know someone like that too, Jamie quipped, so quickly it sounded like he'd been waiting for it. Jack pressed his lips together like he was holding back a laugh. Hiccup raised his brows. I wonder who that is, he said dryly. The twins seem fun as well, Jack concluded. Just the right amount of crazy. At least you'll never be bored around them. Hiccup shook his head, letting out an exasperated chuckle. For better or worse, he said. I won't say I told you so. Toothless chose that moment to grumble indignantly, shoving his head against Hiccup's side. Hiccup stumbled, but caught himself before he could fall on his ass in front of Jack and Jamie. Hey! He yapped at Toothless, but Toothless just replied with a glower, huffing loudly. I told you, I'll fly with you later. Toothless made a weird noise, like he was trying to imitate Hiccup's voice. Hiccup rolled his eyes. Yeah, real mature. You understand him so easily, Jack said, looking at Toothless curiously. You speak dragon? He makes himself understood, Hiccup said, and shook his head when Toothless shot him another nasty look. He's grumpy because he wants to go flying. We usually do around this time. But you're here because of us? Jamie asked, a guilty look on his face. Hiccup hesitated. I mean, sometimes duty comes first, he said. It's all right. He's just spoiled. Ouch! Toothless had hit him with one of his wings, and then proceeded to pointedly act as if nothing had happened. Hiccup rubbed the side of his face. Why don't you just fly on his own? Jack asked. There was a beat that probably lasted a bit too long. Well, you see... Hiccup! Hiccup was glad to be saved from that explanation, and turned around to see Fishlegs and Meatluck waving at them from where they'd found a nice patch of grass to sit, overlooking the ocean. Meatluck was munching on a pile of rocks, and Fishlegs on what looked like yak leftovers from yesterday. Oh, it's like Gothi's dragon, Jamie said excitedly. A Gronkle, right? What's his name? Hiccup nodded for them to follow him over to Fishlegs. Her name is Meatluck, and she's a girl, he said, waving back at Fishlegs. I'm sure Fishlegs will love to tell you all about her. Meatluck? Jamie said, grinning. Why do all of you, your dragons, have such weird names? Jack laughed. It's the war of gnomes and trolls, apparently, he said. The twins told me when they accused me of being the latter. Good morning, Fishlegs said when they approached. He'd gotten to his feet and looked a bit tense, like he was anxious to make a good impression. He smiled nervously at Jack. Hello again, and nice to meet you. You must be Jack's little brother, he then said to Jamie. Oh, yes, Jamie said, a little shyly. My name's Jamie, he said, holding his hand out to Fishlegs. Fishlegs smiled brightly. He'd always been the best with kids out of Hiccup and his friends. They shook hands, a bit awkwardly at first, since Jamie went for Fishleg's hand and Fishleg for Jamie's forearm, but in the end settled for the way they usually did it on Berk, a firm grip around each other's forearms. And I'm Fishlegs. This is Meatluck, Fishleg said, gesturing to his dragon. Meatluck perked up at the sound of her name. She's so cool, Jamie said, inching towards her, hesitantly holding out his hand. Can I? Of course. Hiccup watched them and realized he hadn't even said a word to introduce them. It seemed Jamie and Fishlegs got along swimmingly without help. Hiccup was glad he had at least one friend who knew how to deal with kids. Beside Hiccup, Jack was watching them as well, wearing a slightly odd expression as Jamie pet Meatlug's scaly nose. Jamie's childish excitement shone so bright, Hiccup almost forgot that Jack didn't know any more about dragons than his brother. Jack caught his eyes, and there was a slight, now almost invisible, hint of surprise in his expression, like he was shocked Hiccup was paying him any attention. It made Hiccup wonder what kind of life he'd been living up until now. And then it was gone, and Jack was smiling again. He took a step closer to Hiccup and said in a soft voice so that the other two wouldn't hear, "I like fish legs too. Your friends are cool." "I'm not surprised you like fish legs," Hiccup replied, returning Jack's smile. "You already have one thing in common. You're good with kids. Although, from what I've seen, you're even better at dealing with them than fish legs. Honestly, not even the parents of those kids you met at the arena can handle them as well as you did. How?" Jack chuckled softly, bringing his staff closer to his chest as he looked at Jamie. "I just like kids," he said. He looked like he was going to say something more, but then his smile faltered a little, a shadow passing over his face, as if he just remembered something sad. Hiccup was about to ask him what was wrong, but was interrupted by a sound. Jack's stomach rumbling. Jack looked down, eyes wide. "Oh, right," he muttered, scratching his head. "Haven't you had breakfast?" Hiccup asked. Jack shook his head. "Astrid came to get us early in the morning," he said. There was a slight pinkish hue on his pale cheeks. He frowned, looking at Jamie again. "So that's why my stomach hurts. I forgot that." He trailed off, then cleared his throat. He looked up at Hiccup. Or how do you eat? Where? When?" "You're hungry?" Fishlegs then asked. He held up his bowl of yak leftovers. "There's more than enough to share." Hiccup gave him an impressed look. Fishlegs didn't often share his food. He really wanted to make friends with Jack and Jamie, didn't he? Toothless chose that time to shove his head against Hiccup's backside, making him stumble into Jack. Jack made a small, surprised noise, but thankfully didn't fall. "Toothless!" Hiccup complained once they'd both regained their balance. Toothless growled at him, and Jack laughed nervously. "Why don't you go fly with him? Jamie and I can stay here and eat with Fishlegs in the meantime," he suggested, and nodded at Toothless. "Like, before he eats us." Hiccup laughed in surprise. "He won't eat you," he reassured him. "Most dragons just eat fish, Toothless included, but—" He looked up at Toothless, who, upon hearing Jack's suggestion, was now giving him puppy dog eyes. Hiccup sighed soundlessly, petting his big head. "A small ride won't hurt. We have to stay nearby, though. Hear that, Bud?" Toothless immediately perked up. He hopped around before stopping to let Hiccup on. Hiccup smiled fondly and climbed onto the saddle. He fastened the security and looked at Jack. "I'll be back in a— Whoa, Toothless!" Toothless did, apparently, have no patience left to spare, and they were in the air before Hiccup could finish his sentence. The ground rapidly shrank beneath them, and Jack and the others became miniature figures. Hiccup leaned forward and let out a breathy laugh when Toothless growled happily. They flew in a wide circle over the ocean, higher and higher until they reached the clouds. Hiccup glanced down to the ground. It was hard to see, but he thought the others were watching them. Hiccup felt a smirk grow on his lips. "What do you say we give him a little show, Bud?" he asked. Toothless growled in agreement. Hiccup steadied himself and turned the gear. Toothless dived. It was so sudden, Hiccup almost lost his grip on the saddle. The wind made his hair stand straight back, and it was hard to breathe. His stomach made barrel rolls, and his heart felt like it was going to beat out of his chest. He loved every second of it. Just before they hit the water, Toothless changed course, speeding across the waves. He put one paw in the water, making it splash out to each side of him, leaving a wide path in their wake. They dipped past statues in the water, and then they were ascending again, spinning in the air. Hiccup whooped as they split the cloud layer, and in the next second they were bathing in sunlight. Hiccup let go of the saddle to feel the wind passing them by and closed his eyes, sighing deeply. Up here, it was so easy to forget about his troubles. Especially with the clouds beneath them, it felt as if he was shut away from the real world below. It was like he could stay up here forever, just him, Toothless, and the wind as one. But Toothless had other ideas. He laughed in that dragony way of his, and Hiccup opened his eyes suspiciously. He felt the wind slow down around them, and saw that Toothless had stopped beating his wings. Hiccup's hair went from being swept backwards to floating loosely around his head, and then straight up. It wasn't abnormal that Toothless let them fall like this, but as they broke through the clouds and plummeted towards the water, rapidly gaining speed, Hiccup started to get worried. Toothless? He tried. Toothless ignored him. The water was rushing towards them. Toothless, now would be a good time to change course. Even if he could barely hear himself over the wind in his ears, he knew Toothless could hear him easily. And he still wasn't responding. Hiccup tried shouting some more at him, but his voice soon turned into a panicked holler. And then, just before they hit the water, Toothless made a sharp turn, almost flattening Hiccup against his back. Hiccup wheezed, feeling lightheaded. Very, very funny, you overgrown lizard, he panted. Was that your revenge, huh? Are you happy now? Toothless huffed, and Hiccup shook his head with an exasperated laugh. How a dragon could be such a drama queen was truly something to ponder about. They flew around for a little while longer, with better cooperation now that Toothless felt like Hiccup had learned his lesson about postponing their flights. Though as much as Hiccup wanted to stay in the air, he knew he had to get back to Jack and Jamie. Not that they thought they were going to cause any kind of trouble, especially not while Fishlegs could keep an eye on them. But his father wouldn't be happy if he found out Hiccup was up here instead of down there with them. He managed to convince Toothless to land, with the promise that they would make a longer flight the following evening. Jack, Jamie, Fishlegs, and Meatlock were sitting in a circle on the grass when Hiccup and Toothless returned. Jack was the first one to spot them, a piece of yak meat halfway to his mouth, because he was already looking at the sky. It was hard to see from a distance, but there was something off about Jack's expression. He looked kind of distant, and he lacked his usual cheerfulness. Other than that, his expression was hard to decipher, and the moment Jack met Hiccup's eyes, the expression disappeared. Thought you lost control there for a moment, Jack said as Toothless padded over to them. He was grinning from ear to ear. Your voice is louder than I thought. Hiccup dismounted Toothless and huffed. Ha ha, he said dryly, sending Toothless a pointed look. Are you satisfied? You enjoy making me look like a dork in front of our guests? Toothless' head bobbed up and down, and he made a guttural noise. In other words, he was laughing. Hiccup, that was awesome! Jamie exclaimed, getting up to bounce on the balls of his feet. His eyes were so round with excitement, it looked like they were going to pop right out of his skull. The way you spun and diced, and like how you just shot through the clouds like... did you fall on purpose? Hiccup was sure he was blushing. Toothless sure fell on purpose, he replied sheepishly. But, well, thanks, Jamie. Toothless crooned, pushing his head against Jamie's side, though in a more gentle way than he usually did with Hiccup. Jamie gasped, but once he realized Toothless was just asking for attention, he started giggling and gave him what he wanted. He's like a big cat, Jack murmured incredulously. Where's the bloodthirsty beast from all the stories? Hiccup wondered again how Jack and Jamie had never encountered a dragon before. Even if they weren't from the archipelago, how had they come this far without seeing one? Oh, they're around too, Hiccup said, studying Toothless and Jamie. Fishlegs had joined in on petting Toothless, and they had already started chatting about dragons and dragon riding. Hiccup just hoped Fishlegs wouldn't spill anything vital. Just gotta know which ones will kill you and which ones will, hesitate and eventually decide not to. And how do you know that? Jack asked. Hiccup hummed thoughtfully. If you really are going to stay here for a while, he started, slightly hesitant. His wariness wasn't unreasonable, but at the same time, Jack and Jamie had yet to show any signs that they would trick them or cause any trouble in any way. The possibility that they were just spies was far from ruled out, but then there was also another possibility. The one where Jack and Jamie were truly just a couple of lost brothers, who were probably more wary and scared than Hiccup could ever be. If they turned out to be innocent, and Hiccup had neglected them the safety they needed and deserved... You should learn about this stuff, he continued, nodding to himself. Both about dragons and fighting. Berk and the archipelago is, harsh. You've got lots to learn. Jack frowned. Fighting? Jamie's just 11, he said. And how old are you? Hiccup asked. Jack's lips were slightly parted, staring at Hiccup as if that question was offensive or shocking somehow. Maybe it was where Jack and Jamie came from. When Jack spoke again, his tone sounded slightly off. 17, he replied, and some more. It was a weird way to put it, but Hiccup didn't question it. And you knocked Snotlout to the ground earlier, Hiccup said. I didn't see exactly what happened, but both Garber and Snotlout seemed impressed. Well, more like offended in Snotlout's case. Garber isn't easily impressed, yet you impressed him with your fighting. I feel like it was more self-defense, Jack cut in, though he was twirling his staff with a self-satisfied smile on his face. And you don't get good like that overnight, obviously. You must have been young when you started fighting. Jack was sending him a long look. His hazel eyes suddenly felt piercing, calculating, like he was reading Hiccup's thoughts. Hiccup shifted self-consciously. Or am I wrong? He added lamely. Jack held his gaze for a few more seconds before he took a deep breath and looked at his staff instead. My circumstances were different, he said. If anyone's going to learn to fight, it's going to be me, not Jamie. Hiccup knew Berk, and, better than anyone, the rest of the archipelago. It was a pretty merciless place if you found yourself in a difficult situation, and, sooner or later, most people did. Hiccup was unsure how long Jack would be able to think the way he did, and for his and Jamie's sake, he hoped it was a long time. But he doubted it. On Berk, they learned from early on how to defend themselves. Most of the kids on Berk knew the basics of sword fighting and archery, and Jamie was already the odd one out. Being defenseless would do more harm than good. But Hiccup decided not to argue with Jack about that. At least not yet. All right, he said. It's nothing you have to worry about yet anyway. My father doesn't trust you, and teaching a potential enemy all our fighting secrets isn't a very strategic move. A faint smile passed over Jack's lips, but he seemed distant as he watched Jamie. Hopefully we won't stay long enough to worry about it all, he said quietly. Where will you go? Hiccup asked. The remnants of Jack's smile faded, replaced by a worried yet determined frown. Home, he replied, and if Hiccup didn't imagine it, his hold on the staff tightened. I just have to find out how. Hiccup didn't know what to make of the expression Jack was wearing, nor the words he said. Still, there was a kind of sadness about him that Hiccup knew all too well. Maybe that was why he was able to see it, even if Jack was good at hiding it. Hiccup studied him for a few seconds. His hand twitched, wanting to touch Jack's shoulder reassuringly, but he remembered the way Jack had tensed earlier. Well, he started, and Jack met his eyes again. Hiccup sent him a kind smile. You don't seem like bad people to me. You'll get to go home in the end. Just know you're not alone, all right? Jack was quiet, but he held Hiccup's gaze. Again, he had that look in his eyes, steady, observant, and mindful, making him seem older than he really was. It didn't match the image of him Hiccup had been starting to form, the weird, possibly slightly insane young man with a bad case of amnesia. Hiccup knew what crazy looked like. It lit up the eyes of people like Dagger and Elvin, and countless other Vikings he'd encountered. Jack had nothing of that. Jack nodded at him, smiling gratefully. Thank you, Hiccup, he said softly.